Hi, I'm Rob Buckingham and welcome to Bayside TV. Today on the show we have guest band The Anti-Fall Movement and we ask a question that divides many people. But first we'll hear Sam Childers, better known as the Machine Gun Preacher, share a bit of his story. Tell us about your background, Sam, before you started the cause of saving children in Sudan.
You know, if you look at my background years ago, I think the easiest way, because I could go on for hours talking about it, the easiest thing to say is I was just a scum of the earth. I was just a little bit mean and a little bit full of the devil, you know, maybe a little more than other people, but I was no good. I got into a really bad bar fight and it turned out to be a shootout, and almost lost my life, and I knew on the way home that I was going to change. I mean, I made up my mind, I'm done living this life. I knew somebody was going to take my life for something stupid. And I just made up my mind, I'm done. And now it was 2 years later till I walked into that church and said, God, here I am.
Have you struggled with the method of leading armed raids against the Lord's Resistance Army in Sudan to save the children?
I have never talked about the violence part with anybody that I have ever done interviews with. And I can't, even with you. And I tell you why, is I believe if we're going to boast about anything, it should be about the goodness of Jesus Christ. But I don't believe that children should be raped. I don't believe children should have their arms cut off, lips cut off, nailed to trees. And I believe that on Judgment Day, I have a lot of things to answer for. And I don't know if some of the things I've done is right or wrong, but I know that on Judgment Day, I'm going to keep the man tied up for a while, giving him a few answers.
Fascinating story, Machine Gun Preacher, Sam Childers, from the movie and the book, of course, of the same name. We're going to be looking at the subject today, is it ever right to fight? And to help us discuss this, Reverend Simon Moyle, an anti-war activist. Welcome, Simon.
Thanks for having me.
It's great. And you're sitting right next to Barry Hurd, who is a Vietnam vet. Hi, Barry.
Hi.
And welcome to Bayside TV today.
You.
And of course, my lovely co-host and wife, Christi B.
Great to be here.
So we're going to get into this very interesting discussion today. Is it ever right to use physical violence to fight a cause? Let's start with you, Simon.
Well, I think it's always right to fight when we're talking about situations of injustice or of oppression. The question, I think, particularly for those of us who follow Jesus, is how do we conduct those fights? And I think that the model that we have in him is that it's always a non-violent fight.
Okay.
And that we have a vast array of non-violent options available to us, which have been modelled in the God that we see revealed in Jesus.
Such as?
Well, I think through history we've seen those sorts of lots of different options that people have taken, from boycott, sanctions, non-violent accompaniment. I think one of the most inspiring movements around at the moment is the Christian peacemaker teams, who actually go into places of entrenched conflict and literally get in the way. That's kind of a double entendre of both getting in the way of Jesus, but also getting in the way of the violence, and doing that not in a way that's not confrontational in the sense of threatening to people. They do that unarmed and actually are able then to diffuse conflict.
Do any of them die?
People have died, yeah. Okay. There was a situation not too long ago, just a few years ago in Iraq, where a guy by the name of Tom Fox was kidnapped and killed as part of that. So non-violence doesn't guarantee that we won't be hurt, as we see in Jesus. You know, he is non-violent, but it doesn't mean we won't get hurt. But what it does mean is that those conflicts have the possibility of being diffused rather than fuelled.
Okay. Barry, let's get your response to that as someone who fought in the Vietnam War.
The most popular politician that's believed in the 20th century was Hitler. And the people in Germany worshipped that man. And I don't think they realised who he actually was. And then he went to war. Hopefully he wanted to conquer the world. So my answer to the question was, when he bombed London, for example, what could they do? And I think the only answer was war, retaliation in that way. But I think it's so complicated because a man with so much ability to speak and persuade, etc., was able to lead a country to that situation.
Yeah.
And I think it still exists today. I have made a comment in my writings that I think a lot of male politicians are not happy until they've taken their country to war and can say, you know, we've got fine.
So it's a bit of a boy thing. Like,
yeah, exactly.
As kids, we get our little toy soldiers and all that kind of thing, and then want to play it out for real when we get bigger. Yeah,
and part of my own experience, particularly in my early training, was I was told, in the army I mean, that I was a fine upstanding young man about to do my country proud. And even in Vietnam we were told by Malcolm Fraser and the like, who was Minister for Defence, that we had done the country proud. We were fine upstanding men. And I'm sure he was not aware of what we'd seen and what we'd done, but even so, that was enough for me to quell any doubt or anything. I was good. I'd done well.
Do you see it that way now, though? Do you have regret now that you ever went over there?
Oh, absolutely. But it's funny that, not funny, but it's interesting because I came home with this misguided and totally bewildered belief that I was coming home as a hero. And I come home as a Vietnam veteran to abuse, to you name it. We were treated.
That's absolutely dreadful.
Yeah.
Because what I find is that everybody wants freedom, and I don't think anybody wants war, but someone has had to pay the price. And whilst let's learn from there. Like, I'd like to know, in your view, should there even be a police force? Because and what happens, like Sam Childers, like who protects? Do they stand back and allow themselves to be killed and the child to be raped and maimed? I don't understand that. I don't.
Yeah, I think one of the major misconceptions with non-violence is that because we're kind of schooled in two ways of thinking. One is in violence, and the other is in passivity and doing nothing. And so that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about either of those things. So if we're talking about non-violence, we're talking about doing something, but doing something that's not violent.
But what if that doesn't work? What if, like your situation, you're being attacked by violence, and I know it's not, nobody wants to be in this situation, then would a pacifist say, absolutely not, under any circumstances, they can bomb us to high heavens, I'm not doing anything? Is that what happens or not?
I think we'd want to kind of clarify what the hypothetical situation was.
Well,
let's pick up what Barry said before. In the Second World War, you've got the forces of Hitler's forces bombing London. What should the British have done?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that lots of information coming out, and we know this from Bonhoeffer, lots of the information coming out of Germany was that no one was happy with Hitler under Germany, and yet they were kind of going along with it. And so there were plots actually to undermine and to get rid of Hitler, but in the end, actually Churchill decided not to believe those rumours that were coming out of Germany. And so what you had was a situation there where had they given aid in that circumstance to people who were trying to undermine Hitler and Hitler's power, we have to realise that a Hitler or any dictator only has as much power as we give them as people.
Was that Churchill or Neville Chamberlain, the guy who was before?
That was Churchill afterwards, later in the war.
All right.
That's right. So we have to realise that people who are in those sorts of positions of power only have the amount of authority that we give them in terms of going along. And so this is why Gandhi really encouraged non-cooperation with evil being as much a duty as cooperation with good. When we withdraw our cooperation, those people cease to have the power that we invest in them.
Okay. Now, Christi's probably got a different view, and just before we go to the break, you are Irish, you grew up in Ireland, and your situation was very different.
And so I grew up with everybody trying to do peaceful talking. Meanwhile, people are getting murdered, and we did have to have people in the police force. We did have to have people who were armed. There were people. I have had family blown up in bombs. I have friends that were murdered. And I wonder, to make a choice whether you go to war or whether you don't go to war, you know, do you have to have any kind of personal qualification? Like you've seen what war does, I've seen what it does. Can you just decide not to go to war from an ideal perspective, or have you been touched by it personally?
Yeah. We'll come back and answer that question in just a moment. After the break, Campbell Vandersloot hits the streets with Street Talk.
It's a fact. Since the dawn of time, there's been wars and conflict. Does that make it okay? Are wars ever okay?
No.
Never?
Never.
And why do you think that is?
Because they go on for too long. No one ever wins.
Yes, definitely. War provides jobs, so it's good for economy. And if you want to get oil and stuff like that, it's great, I think.
I don't think violence is the best way to deal with things, ever. Having said that, I guess there's exceptional circumstances that you can't have general rules for.
Probably not.
Why do you think that is?
Because there's just too much tragedy and misery and sadness, and it never solves anything.
That's a tricky one. Look, I'm not a big fan of violence or sorting things out using violence, and I try to teach my child to use, sort out conflicts with words, and if it doesn't work out, just walk away. People are entitled to their own opinion, but no, I don't think it's okay. But some people do think that's the way forward, and what can you do?
Do you believe that anything good can come out of a war?
No.
I think that's a really hard question. I guess that they must. It's really so difficult, isn't it? If you're trying to defend something that you really believe in and trying to support your community, I guess I can understand why people would go to war, but I can't ever imagine being involved in it myself. So I'm sort of talking from quite a distance away.
Lots of different comments there. Yes, no, maybe, somewhere in between. Christi, you had a question just before the break.
Yeah, I think I just want to know if there is ever a place that you can use violence. Like, I don't know what else this guy could do with 30,000 children being raped and maimed. The machine gun preacher.
Sam Childers, yeah.
And not actually deal with these guys. Like, you're not going to sit down and talk to them. So how many, does another child have to go, and another one, and another one, and another one? I mean, that concerns me, and it concerns me all the talking and, this guy not getting flushed out.
Of course, yeah, and that's why what we're not talking about here is apathy. We're not talking about passivity or letting things happen. That's why nonviolence is always active and always pursuing. But it recognises that these evil sorts of deeds run through the heart of all of us. We can't just demonise some people and say they're the bad guys. They're the only ones doing anything wrong.
So Simon, if you were Sam Childers, for example, and you're working in Sudan, which is a reasonably lawless country, where you've got armed militia coming in and doing all sorts of despicable acts to kids and blowing up your orphanage, what would you do?
Well, and this is the question, because I think what we see Sam doing is actually fueling a conflict, unfortunately. And I think that's what wars tend to do. They don't tend to create peace because they can't, because violence will only ever kind of fuel itself.
So how would you
So I think
bring
the
peace?
only way to do it is with active love, the kind of love that we see.
But how does that work with
So going to,
militia?
I mean, I don't think it would be appropriate for someone like me to do it, for example, because, I mean,
so you wouldn't be over in the Sudan in the first place?
Well, what's happening over there at the moment is, with Sam, is the typical kind of Hollywood thing where the white guy goes in to save everyone. It's not realistic, and it's not actually necessarily helping the situation, because what's happening is he's endangering a whole lot of aid workers over there who are trying to do the same kinds of aid that Sam's doing, but because he's doing it with a gun, the assumption is that they are also doing it with a gun, and therefore they get endangered. So we have to recognise the complexity of all of the situation around it. This is not as simple as bad guys and good guys, and the bad guy, you know, the good guys get the bad guys. But this is so much more complex than that.
So let me ask you a question, because I think to be a pacifist or an activist, you almost have to have a kind of a qualification. So you've had people you know, comrades, that have been murdered by an enemy. I've had people I know murdered by an enemy. Have you had anyone that you know murdered by an enemy? I'm talking about a person that you know.
Yeah, so I've had friends, not friends themselves, but their families have been.
Yep.
So I took a trip over to Afghanistan last year, and I spent time with some young people called the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers, all of whom have had brothers, mothers, fathers murdered by either the Taliban or by the US. And this is what they're telling me, that war cannot make for peace. We've had war in our country, they say, for 100 years, and it has not brought us peace.
You know?
I want to mention as well, you know, Barry, you've written this book. It's called Well Done Those Men. And I believe that this is maybe in the process or the early stages of being turned into a movie. Tell us a little bit about your book.
My experience from Vietnam, like most Vietnam veterans, I kept to myself for about 30 years. I struggled, but no one was aware of it. I was, you know, the good husband and a hard worker, well educated. And it wasn't until we had the Welcome Home March some 20 years after I came back from Vietnam, and I was living in Perth, where no one knew I was a Vietnam veteran. That was the only...
Was that a deliberate thing?
I asked that of my wife, not to tell anyone. And I was stunned to see the people in Sydney clap and cheer Vietnam veterans. I was stunned. My experience was a university in Melbourne where I was at one stage urinated on, and you know, quite horrific. But good and all as that was, when we first had our first reunion, which was nearly 5 years, so we're now looking at 1992, and I'm an old man by this time, nearly 50-year-old, I was very taken aback and shocked by the condition of a lot of the men. A lot of them were social misfits, a lot of them were alcoholics, a lot of them marriage breakup, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And
it's a big
I saw a lot of the men's health deteriorate, and then sadly suicides, and then finally it started to get very personal, because where I live there was a suicide, and there was 2 children of Vietnam veterans suicide, which is, we have a horrific statistic with our children. And then my best mate suicided, and that was the end of me, because I couldn't handle any more. And I collapsed one night in bed with an old lady screaming at me, so I imagined it was not true, but I told my wife to tell her to go away. And I can't remember the next 12 months.
Wow. So,
I was wearing nappies and very sick. And the next thing, as I gradually got my health back a little bit, where I could actually go to the toilet on my own and walk around the yard and things like that. I was not capable even of that. Then they placed me in the psychiatric ward in Melbourne. But the interesting thing, the basic message to my family was I had 3 months to live. And it's the last bit of the book, but we'd been asked for a couple of years, and we're now talking of 2000, you know, and I was sick in 95. The year 2000, I'd been asked on many occasions would I go and speak at a school, because Vietnam veterans won't do it generally. And so I picked a very small school of only 26 kids and a principal and 1 teacher, and I went to that school and started to talk, and I broke down. But so did the female teacher. She's crying, I'm crying, and the principal started to go as well. And so he asked all the children to leave. And from that, I calmed down, but and I was having morning tea, and I was going to go home, and that's it, never speak at another school. And the biggest girl in the school knocked on the door and approached me and said, would I talk, it was in a little tiny country town, would I talk to the placard in the hall that honoured World War I soldiers? And, you know, no way. Until I looked out the door, and all the kids lined up holding flowers. And I knew I had no choice. And so here's myself and the teacher crying, the principal bewildered up the back, and the children led us across. They led us across the road. They took us into the hall, they formed a horseshoe, and then they looked at me to say something. And all I said was, these men here on this wall would say two things. One, they'd like to thank you for what you're doing. It's so beautiful, and that I hope you never have to go to war. And from all of that, that's when I went home and said, okay, I'm not only going to show my wife, I'm going to write about properly. Yeah, it's just won the #1 book in Victoria.
Well done, those men.
Yeah.
And well done, Barry, for coming through a very difficult time.
Yeah.
We've run out of time, but Barry, thank you for your time today,
okay.
and Simon as well, and Christy.
Lots of food for thought.
Absolutely. After the break, we have guest band The Anti-Fall Movement performing. Stay tuned for that. Welcome back to Bayside TV. Now performing their song Free, The Anti-Fall Movement. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
You know I just want to be that same old someone that is real. I don't want to change for the world. I want to be free. Yeah, people tell me that I'm strange, that my head is rearranged. But when I first saw you, I knew I was free. Cause I want to be the one that you want, and to be the one that you want, and to be the one you want me to be. Yeah. You know that you're really great. I think I've known since I was 8. But where I sang songs about you, and I didn't know I was free. 'Cause I want